So, welcome back, everyone, to another edition of Battlefield Tours with Rob Woolsey. We are very thankful to have him. I say it every time, and I'll say it every single time. My name is Mickey, but my full name is Michael Blanchebrun. I am MFS Europe's virtual program coordinator. So, today I will be acting as your virtual host. And I am very happy we're having this session before Remembrance Day because it's right around the corner and it's going to really hit home on that theme. So, I know being Alcan, it can seem harder maybe to remember in the sense that you're not back home and ceremonies might not seem as easy to find. But I think today you'll learn in fact that there's different ways to commemorate the fallen Canadian soldiers, even within Europe or around the world. But I won't steal that punch from Rob. I'll let him elaborate on that. So tonight or today, depending on where you are in the world, Rob will bring you on a journey to commemorate the fallen as it is the 80th anniversary of the Second World War. On that note, I'll let Rob take it away and enjoy, everyone.
Thank you, Mickey. Well, good evening or good day to everyone. My name is Rob Woolsey, and I am a member of the International Guild of Battlefield Guides and the owner-operator of Woolsey's War Walks, which is a Canadian focused battlefield tour group. And I also have a Facebook page, which is part of that. And what we're going to be talking today is about commemorating the fallen, because I get many, many questions from a lot of people on how to do their Remembrance Day or an act of remembrance when they're going on a tour or going to visit places. And I'm going to point out that the photo that you see on this one is me at Adirondack Cemetery on the Somme. And that day I was doing a personal tour for somebody, and they wanted to do an active remembrance because they had a family member that was missing, and they chose Adirondack Cemetery because it's Canada backwards. And so we did a personal act of commemoration and a personal act of remembrance, which is pretty important. So the disclaimer: Military Family Services Europe is not affiliated with any companies, apps, or products that I mentioned in this presentation, and they are not sponsored by, do not sponsor, do not endorse any of the companies, apps, products named in this presentation. They're just things that I do or I recommend you can use, and they're things that I use as a guide. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about a locations overview. We're going to talk about recommended preparations for doing these things, travel advisories, visas and security, helpful tips, First World War fallen locations, Second World War fallen locations, details of the cemetery so you understand what you're looking at, the types of cemeteries you will see, because there are many types, the memorials to the missing, how you can commemorate, planning a visit, and just some points that are worth a mention. So the picture on this slide is the Air Services Memorial at Arras. It's the Canadian names on the memorial to the missing, which are air crew. So everybody thinks that only the First World War missing are on Vimy Ridge. That's not correct. There is Canadians at Vimy Ridge. There's Canadians in the UK on two memorials there, and there is Canadians, of course, on the Menin Gate, and now also as well at Arras, which is the Air Services Memorial. So Canadian fallen are in 74 different countries around the world. And they are both in cemeteries and memorials to the missing. So they're not just in a cemetery and they're not just on a wall. They're actually in a combination of the both. The total Canadian fallen from the two world wars, first and second, is 110,000. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission works predominantly in English, although they are sponsored by many countries of the Commonwealth, and they do hire locals to do all the work on their cemeteries. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission was formed as the Imperial War Graves Commission on the 21st of May, 1917, by Sir Fabian Ware to take care of the fallen from the First World War, and continued its work into the Second World War, and it cares for a total of about 1.7 million war dead, which is a lot. And the costs of this are covered by Canada, India, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the UK. One of the cool facts is the cemeteries of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission were designed by some of the best architects, sculptors, horticulturists in the world, with the materials used suitable to the area where they were built. And the last cemetery, which is a First World War cemetery, in fact, was completed in 2008, and it's the Formels Pheasant Wood Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery. Oops. My apologies. Let me fix that. So, weather. Always check the weather before visiting a location, because normally at Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemeteries and locations, there is no shelter. You can visit any time of year, but May to November are usually the nicest if you're visiting in Europe. Basically, you want to visit in the middle spring till about the late fall, and pretty much anywhere in the world, depending on where you are in the world, depends on when summer and fall is and spring. But that's the best time to see them. That's when the flowers are in bloom. That's when the trees are prettiest. That's when they are in their best shape. Always bring a rain jacket. It helps break the wind, and always have good footwear for walking because most of the cemeteries don't have paths. Or in some cemeteries, you actually have to walk in down some pretty rugged paths in some cases to get to them and visit the fallen. All the cemeteries and memorials are child friendly. In fact, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission encourages families to come visit them and visit their own fallen family members, or just in general visit, so that people can understand and continue the commemoration of the fallen. And of course, we're all over the world. So in some of the areas, there are city passes, but generally speaking, where most cemeteries are, there are no city passes. My apologies again. It keeps on jumping to the wrong slide. There we go. All right. So if you're traveling anywhere, always go to the Government of Canada travel advisories. You never know what you can find. The risks go up and down depending where you are in the world. It's really important that you are using those and following those. And of course, also check the Government of Canada website to make sure you don't need a visa, or if you're going somewhere you do need a visa, that you can get it with enough time. It actually takes up to 3 months in some cases to get visas. Always check your security considerations before. Most sites are really safe because but there are a few that are located in cities or less safe locations. Most people don't know there's a Commonwealth War Graves Commission cemetery in Cologne, for example, or in Gaza City itself, which is at the moment quite a dangerous place to go visit. Always travel with medical insurance, and make sure that you know where the local hospitals and clinics are. That's one thing I do as a guide. In case something goes wrong, I know where they are. 112 or 911 actually work anywhere in the world for emergency phone numbers. The two are interlinked. And always check to make sure you know where the local closest embassy or consulate is. You'd be amazed how few of them there are in the world, and you might need that in case you need consular assistance. So, some helpful tips. The fallen are in cemeteries all over the world, and the Commonwealth War Graves Commission website is a great resource to see if any are commemorated near you. They also have an app for your telephone, which is super handy. Always have great footwear. Cemeteries and memorials are sometimes paved, but often are not. There'll be grass and trails, and you want to have good footwear to be safe. This is a photo of Tyne Cot. It can be really quite muddy in the Ypres salient, and so I always recommend that people always have good footwear, because I've walked through that cemetery in the height of summer and in the middle of winter, and it always seems to be very, very wet. So very important. So the First World War fallen. The First World War was an event that started the acts of remembrance that we do today. The Imperial War Graves Commission, as of 1960, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, became the organization to ensure the preservation and commemoration of war dead from all over the world. Today, there's 25,760 locations where there are Commonwealth War Grave Commission fallen that they're responsible for, in 153 countries. For, as I said earlier, a total of 1.7 million. That's a lot of work. Most Canadians think of the Western Front when they think of the First World War, which is where a majority of the Canadian war dead are, in fact, France and Belgium. But did you know that there are 3,895 Canadian soldiers from the First World War commemorated in the United Kingdom? There's another 6,839 in Canada and 126 in Germany. In fact, soldiers, sailors, and airmen of Canada are commemorated today in 28 different countries from the First World War and 3,500 locations. The men killed in action make sense to us, as do those who died of their wounds, be that in France, the United Kingdom, or Canada. But we often forget those who died of accidents, traffic, or training, or died of illness or disease. And then there are the odd one or twos in odd places like Cuba, Sierra Leone, India, and Tanzania, which in some cases are Canadians either on loan to the British forces, they're airmen with the Royal Flying Corps or the Royal Air Force, or their sailors or ship's crew. In total, there were 66,000 Canadian war dead from 1914 to 1919. There are a few exclusively Canadian cemeteries, such as the Second Canadian Cemetery, sunken road in France, being pretty exceptional. All of its commemorations are from the 2nd Eastern Ontario Battalion, and it is just south of the town of Pozières. It's a little tiny cemetery. What most would find shocking is how many are commemorated in towns and cities across Canada. Elmvale, Ontario, which is a town of 2,300 people, has 2 First World War men commemorated in their cemetery. One from the Royal Air Force who died in an airplane crash, and one Canadian from the 177th Simcoe Foresters Battalion. In Banff, Alberta, the old cemetery there has 3 First World War fallen. One is a Hungarian army prisoner of war that was interned in Canada, and 2 from the 103rd Regiment, the Calgary Rifles. So they are actually all over the place. So Belgium has 14,000 Canadians between the men in gate and all the cemeteries. There's 10 in Bermuda, as I said, 6,800 in Canada. There is 1 person in Cuba, 1 in Denmark, 15 in Egypt, 39,710 in France, 126 are in Germany. Those would be prisoners of war that died of their wounds or illnesses. There's 12 in Greece. Those are mostly Canadians in medical units. There's 2 in India. There's 1 in Iraq. There's 33 in Ireland, which at the time was part of the United Kingdom. There's 5 in Israel, Palestine, 2 in Italy, 1 in Lebanon, 4 in Malta, 2 in the Netherlands. There's 8 commemorated online, which is an oddball. I don't understand that one, but it's considered they're online because they're only commemorated in a book. There's 2 in Poland. There's 24 Canadians commemorated in Russia, in fact, from our intervention there in 1919. 2 in Sierra Leone, 2 in South Africa, 10 in Switzerland, 225 in the United States, and 22 in Turkey. So that's a lot of people in a lot of really out of the way places. So when we think of the cemeteries in Belgium and France, there are lots and lots and lots of cemeteries that you can go visit them at. But when you're in the rest of the world, you'd be amazed how many other places there are. So the Second World War fallen. The Second World War was far more global for Canadians, and this is seen by the fact that the Canadian war dead are in 71 different countries for a total of 45,389 casualties. In some cases, the Canadian war dead from the Second World War were buried in the First World War cemeteries, a common occurrence for aircrew deaths, such as at Canada Cemetery near Cambrai, France, which has an RCAF bomber crew, which was buried along the cemetery wall, which is a 3rd Canadian Division cemetery from the 1918 Battle of Cambrai. And their airplane literally crashed 1 kilometer from that cemetery. There's a memorial to their airplane crash, and that aircrew is buried in the same cemetery, but separate from the First World War fallen. Because of the wider scope and longer length of the war, you will find Canadians in Malta, Hong Kong, India, Japan, which were prisoners of war, Algeria, Iceland, Poland, and Norway. What is neat is that when living in Europe, they are literally all over the place and easy to visit. There are the usual war dead in the United Kingdom, 8,800 in fact, and in Canada, there's 9,712, 21 of them. Many Canadians who are buried in Canada are in local cemeteries, although there are some larger cemeteries from the British Commonwealth Air Training Program due to the significant number of accidents and crashes from people learning to fly. There are also accidents in training in men and women who died of wounds. Second World War Canadian cemeteries do exist, and they are called Canadian War Cemetery, but they do have other nations in them. Dieppe Cemetery Dieppe Canadian War Cemetery is a great example and contains mostly Canadians, but there are British and 7 non-Commonwealth burials out of the 948 total commemorations and 187 unknowns, all from the battle at Dieppe. It was built by the Germans after the battle, and the headstones are in the German style, which means they're head-to-head instead of single rows, which is the British style. In Germany, you will only find Royal Canadian Air Force crews and POWs that died in captivity. Canadian Army war dead who fell in Germany are buried in the Netherlands, as the 1st Canadian Army commander, Harry Crear, said that none of his troops would be buried on enemy soil. But, interesting fact, there is actually 1 Canadian Army soldier who fell in action who is buried in Germany. He is in fact in the Reichswald Forest Cemetery along with 704 RCAF aircrew. This is different from Italy, where Canadians are buried, such as at Gira on Sicily or Moor River in Ortona, or Cariano Ridge cemeteries. So because of the global scope and because Canadians staged out of different areas, as you can see from this list, it is quite significant. There's 81 soldiers from Algeria. Now, some of those are Canadian officers on exchange. We sent 236 Canadian Army officers and senior NCOs to British units to fight with the British First Army in North Africa to gain combat experience, and 19 of those were killed and wounded. My grandfather, in fact, was one of those 19. He was wounded in North Africa. There's 4 in Austria, which were prisoners of war. There's some in the Bahamas, the Azores, Bangladesh. There's not that as many as Belgium because we actually didn't fight that much in Belgium in the Second World War. There's one in Bulgaria. China has 422. They're mostly Hong Kong. There's some in the Czech Republic, Cyprus, of course, 48 in Iceland. Most people don't realize that Canadians occupied Iceland and RCAF squadrons were based out of there as well. There was several Canadian Army battalions spent 6 months there. Hungary, Ghana, Gibraltar, the Faroe Islands. Some of these were there's one in Russia only from the Second World War. There's 3 in South Africa, 4 in Luxembourg. So they're literally all over the place. And some of those that are odds and sods, ones and twos of, are on memorials. So from the First World War, there's a Canadian that's listed on the Basra Memorial to the Missing that's in Basra, Iraq. Some of the others in this Second World War list, a lot of the ones that you find in Malta are on the Malta Memorial, which is just outside the main gate of Valletta itself. And there it's all to the aircrew missing from the Mediterranean campaign. So it is a little bit different. And we're going to talk a little bit more about Second World War missing and all that in a little bit. So cemetery details. So this is interesting because people don't always understand how the cemeteries are and what's in them. And some people use the wrong terminology, and understanding how they're built is really quite important. Every CWGC cemetery has its own distinct features and unique design, but there are key features that are constant throughout. Both the First and Second World War cemetery are actually named, sometimes for the area, such as Courcelette British Cemetery outside the village of Courcelette, where a major Canadian battle was fought. A local feature, Moreau River Canadian War Cemetery, or La Latterie, which is named for the milk, the dairy right beside it in Belgium, just south of Ypres itself. It's called La Latterie British Cemetery. Or a town, Holton Canadian War Cemetery in the Netherlands. A battlefield feature, Regina Trench Cemetery, which is just north of Courcelette. It's literally on the old German trench line, which was called on Canadian maps Regina Trench. A Canadian province, because most of the fallen are from here. Ontario Cemetery, Quebec Cemetery, and Manitoba Cemetery, 3 First World War cemeteries in different areas, are all named because of the large number of fallen. There's also a Toronto Cemetery named after most of the fallen in that area were from the 3rd Toronto Battalion in the First World War. There are some that are named for the dressing station location. One of them is Dosingham, which is a pun on the word dosing them for medicating the soldiers. Dosingham Military Cemetery. And there was 3 of those actually just beside Ypres that are there's Dosingham, Gassingham, and I can't remember the third one. Or they just named it because it was named that way, such as Adirondack Cemetery, which is Canada backwards. For cemeteries that contain more than 40 or more graves, there is a cross of sacrifice designed by Sir Reginald Bloomfield. This is a large stone in the shape of an elongated Latin cross with a bronze long sword affixed to it on the front. You will see it sometimes on the back as well. And the sword is facing down to an octagonal base. Sometimes they are freestanding, such as at Adigem Canadian War Cemetery on the Belgian-Dutch border. Or it'll be part of the wall, like at Lichtfield Crater Cemetery, which is a fairly remote cemetery on the Vimy Ridge battlefield. And the cross is actually built into the wall that surrounds the crater where the fallen were buried in the battle. Or part of another feature. In Tyne Cot, for example, it is built atop a German bunker at the suggestion of King George V during his pilgrimage visit there. And that's where they put it. The stone of sacrifice is present at cemeteries with 1,000 or more burials. And that's the picture on the very top right corner. It's designed by Sir Edwin Lutyens, and it was meant to be appealing to all faiths as part of the equality of remembrance, which is very, very important because everybody's buried the same. Officers, NCMs, the rich, the poor, the nobility are all commemorated the same. They on average are about 3.5 meters long and 1.5 meters high, and are inscribed with "Their name liveth evermore," which was recommended by Rudyard Kipling, who had lost his own son in the war. And what it is not a cenotaph. There is actually no cenotaphs in CWGC cemeteries because a cenotaph is erected as a memorial to someone whose remains are elsewhere or lost. So there are cenotaphs, like memorials to the missing, because their name is on the wall and their bodies are somewhere. But in a CWGC cemetery, there is no cenotaph. The headstones are the last feature. If the soldier is a Commonwealth soldier, then they have the same shape of headstone, with either their regimental or corps badge, which is the British way, or a national emblem, such as the maple leaf for the Canadians, or a branch of service if you're the Royal Canadian Air Force or the Royal Canadian Navy. It'll also have their service number, rank, name, unit, date of death, and with any awards for or medals that they would have earned, along with a religious marker, usually a cross for Christian faiths, a Star of David for Jewish, or it is blank. If a soldier was awarded the Victoria Cross for actions, then the Victoria Cross itself is carved into the headstone. And that's the one below. That's one from one of my visits to Private Robertson from the 27th Battalion at, he's in Tyne-Cot, but he fell at Passchendaele. You may see some odd-shaped headstones in some CWGC cemeteries, and those are of other nations, such as Germans who were rescued from the battlefield and died in a field ambulance or such. Very, very common in the First World War. You will see a little section, sometimes intermixed with the Commonwealth casualties. If it's certain types of cemeteries, other times they've been put on their own little section and out of the way. Foreign troops serving with British forces, such as Second World War militaries in exile. You'll see lots of Poles, Czechs, Belgians, Dutch. They'll have each individual and very unique headstones because they're serving in British-style units as forces in exile, or Allied forces that were attached to British forces. American and French being the most common, and they usually use a cross, but you will see some others every once in a while, Russian, Italian, and all that from the First World War. But you can definitely tell the different nationalities by looking at the stones themselves. They are very, very differently shaped. Each cemetery also has a guest book, which you can sign, as well as a list of commemorations. And usually there's a medal, I'm going to use the word poster, but it's probably not the right word, to give an explanation of the battlefield, who is in the cemetery, by which nationality, and the details of that cemetery in regards to the battle itself. The types of cemetery. Now, this is an interesting one because they are actually quite varying. There are different types of cemeteries within the collection, each one having some specific characteristics. Battlefield cemeteries were created during the war, predominantly in the First World War, just behind the front line to clear the battlefield. They are often much smaller in size and contain what we call called special memorials because the graves have either been destroyed in later fighting or were misplaced, quite literally, because the markers were destroyed, but the graves were not. Givenchy-en-Royal Canadian Cemetery is on the Vimy Ridge battlefield and has several special memorials and many double graves as part of the cleanup. And Zivy Crater is another example, which is one of two unique cemeteries on the Vimy Ridge battlefield, which are former mine craters that the fallen were put into and then are commemorated that way. They chose not to move them. Most battlefields, as I said, cemeteries that remain today are predominantly from First World War sites. You'll see many, many of them on the Somme. You'll see many of them in Flanders as well. And in Belgium around the Ypres salient, you will see some of them. They're not a feature of Second World War battlefields. Most of those started as possibly battlefield cemetery. I'll use Benny-sur-Mer, for example. Benny-sur-Mer started off as a battlefield cemetery and then was later expanded into a concentration cemetery. Medical cemeteries are located at locations of field ambulances, dressing stations, or hospitals. Some of these are absolutely huge and well organized, like a TAPS military cemetery, which has 11,554 people. And it's not the biggest cemetery in the collection, but it is a massive cemetery. And it's a hospital cemetery. In fact, there were several hospitals there. Or you will see smaller ones that are disjointed, chaotic, have special memorials closer to what would have been the front line, such as Essex Farm Cemetery, which has 1,200 burials. And that happens to also be where In Flanders Fields was written in 1915, because that bunker location was the dressing station. Or you'll see Sunken Road Cemetery, which has 213, and it started as a field ambulance location just behind the battlefield. These are men who were usually taken off the battlefield wounded and died of their wounds, and are usually scattered right behind the frontline area, but some are close to rail and roads. Villers Station Cemetery, for example, is right beside what was the old local train station in the area, and it contains 1,208 predominantly Canadians. And many, in some of these situations, are not even identified because they were just hauled off the battlefield and nobody knew who they were, and there was no way to identify them. You will see civilian or churchyard cemeteries, and they're usually early First World War burials or one of burials that were not really collected up later. The town of Basley, for example, not far from Benny-sur-Mer Cemetery, there's a lone British soldier from the 51st Highland Division that's buried. He died in the field hospital that was in the town, or the field ambulance, which was 23rd Canadian Field Ambulance. He died, and he was buried in the churchyard cemetery, and he was never picked up and moved. You will see these types of cemeteries with Second World War air crews as well. Very common. If your airplane went down and you were killed, you were probably hauled to the local cemetery. These are also the most common ones you will find in Canada, the US, and the UK. Edmonton's Beachmount Cemetery, for example, has 79 Second World War commemorations in it. It's been a cemetery for well before that, because it's also not far from the old City Center Airport, which was the old RCAF station there. But it is a cemetery that's been used for over 100 years in Edmonton, and it was used in the Second World War to bury people that died as part of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. You'll also see Hoyt Churchyard in Namur, Belgium, has 25. These are great examples and they are from different wars. Once the civilian or churchyard cemetery was filled up, an extension cemetery would be added to the existing one. Sometimes they're separated by a wall, or other times just a path. These are common all over in Belgium and France from the First World War. Aix-Noulet Communal Cemetery Extension, for example, 1,252, and Hangard Communal Cemetery Extension with 564 in France are good examples of this from the later war period. Aix-Noulet, you can totally see where the old cemetery stopped and start. There's a wall, and then there's a CWGC cemetery literally bolted onto the back of it, as well as a French military cemetery. Concentration cemeteries are the last major type, and these are purpose-built new or started as battlefield cemeteries. As I said, Benny-sur-Mer is a good example of that, Tyncott, and Cabaret Rouge. Cabaret Rouge is a massive cemetery just behind Vimy Ridge. And they are made up of the men brought from their temporary field burials or smaller cemeteries and concentrated into a larger one. Easily recognizable due to their size, clean, well-organized layouts, and on the battlefields that they were actually started on, they usually list which cemetery the men came from before they were moved to this final resting place. And an interesting note, a family would be told where their family member was buried, and then they would receive a second letter later when if they were being concentrated, telling them where they were being moved from, where they were going to, which grave marker, and photos of the new grave location with the new headstone. So here's a couple of pictures. Lickfield Crater is one of my favorites. It's a really hard one to get to, but it's totally worth it. There's a Canadian Victoria Cross recipient in it. Number 2 Canadian Cemetery is that little one just below the Lickfield Crater photo. That is literally all number 2 guys. It's a battlefield cemetery put together by the 2nd Canadian Infantry Battalion. Courcelette British Cemetery, which is right on the battlefield, is a concentration cemetery. It's quite a large one. In fact, the Minister of Militia and Defense's son is buried in that, as well as 2 16-year-old Canadians, one of which is from the RCR. The bottom photo is actually from Elmvale Presbyterian Cemetery. That is Canadian fallen in that cemetery. So there's lots of different types of cemeteries around. Pardon me. So memorials to the missing. When you visit most cemeteries in the Commonwealth War Grave Collection, you will find a soldier of the Great War, or a soldier of the 1939-45 war, or a soldier from a Canadian regiment, or a sergeant from the 49th Battalion, or a wide range of other details, all that could be discovered when the soldier had been recovered. Because of this, the soldier with no known grave is commemorated on a memorial like Vimy Ridge, Groesbeek, Monte Cassino, Runnymede, or Brookwood. The First World War has many memorials to the missing, as about 1/3 of all combatants in that war that fell have never been identified. Some are to battles, such as the Thiepval Memorial, which is a massive 73,000 name memorial to the British who fell in the Battle of the Somme. And they didn't all fit on there. The rest of them are at Pozières, which is another 13,000 names. Or you visit the Menin Gate, which is a massive memorial with 54,000 names to the fallen from the Ypres salient, which had to be carried on with another 33,000 names at Tyne Cot on the wall. Or to the air forces, such as at Runnymede, or in Ottawa, or the Navy Memorial in Halifax. These are usually in order by rank and by nationality, and if it's an Army memorial, it's actually in order of precedence by regiment, by rank, by name. Sometimes, as I said, there's not enough space, so there's an overflow wall. Tyne Cot is a prime example of this. If you're British and you fell after the 15th of August 1915, you are not on the Menin Gate. Those 33,000 names are sitting on the wall with the New Zealanders at Tyne Cot. The big ones, of course, for Canada are Vimy Ridge and the Menin Gate. Vimy Ridge has 11,000 and the Menin Gate has about 6,700 Canadian names on it. But there are also Canadians on the Air Services Memorial in Arras, which I showed you earlier, which has 46. And there's 289 on the Halifax Memorial to the missing. But there are 2 memorials in Russia that have Canadians on them, missing from the 1919 expedition there. There's 4 at Archangel and 3 at Vladivostok. There's 1 in Iraq at the Basra Memorial. There's 1 in Jerusalem on the Jerusalem Memorial, and there's 36 on a memorial in Victoria. The Second World War has memorials to campaigns in areas such as the Malta Air Services Memorial. So that's the Air Services Memorial for missing from the Mediterranean, of which there are 285 Canadians on that. There's 450 on the Ottawa Memorial, which is missing in Canada from the British Commonwealth Air Training Program. I didn't even know that was a CWGC one. I grew up in Ottawa. I visited many times, never connected the dots until I became a tour guide. There's 3,031 at the Runnymede Memorial, which is the Air Services for Northwest Europe. There's the Bayeux Memorial for the Normandy campaign with 268 Canadian missing on it. Groesbeek Canadian Cemetery also has the Groesbeek Memorial, which is for the army losses of Northwest Europe north of the Seine or after the Seine, and it has 96 names on it. There's the Alamein Memorial in North Africa. It's in Egypt. There's 213 Canadians on that memorial from fighting in the North African campaign, predominantly aircrew, but there are some army troops on it. And then there's Saiwan in Hong Kong with 228 missing from the Battle of Hong Kong. Now, I've included Beaumont Hamel Newfoundland Memorial on this because they are now part of Canada, but prior to this, they were not. And if you look at most memorials to the missing of the Second World War, you will find Newfoundland listed completely separately from Canada, and I will give a good example of this. The Malta Memorial has the Newfoundlanders either listed as Newfoundlanders or the Royal Newfoundland Air Force, which I have not been able to confirm that was actually a thing. I said there's 11,000 on the Vimy Ridge Memorial and 6,900. So it's 6,700 Canadians under Canadian units, and the rest are Canadians that served in British units. There's many of those that were Canadians that volunteered. There's the Tower Hill Memorial, 409 from the First World War and 71 from the Second World War. It's a merchant marine, I believe. The Halifax Memorial, which has 280 from the First World War and 2,855 missing from the Second World War. Of course, the Victoria Memorial with 36. The Chappie Memorial, which has 1. Brookwood Memorial has 3. Hollybrook Memorial has 46. That's the naval campaign in and around the British Isles. I said Bass Memorial. The Kirky Memorial to 1914, 18 has one Canadian on it. In the Nassau Memorial, which is a memorial to missing in the Caribbean, there's two Canadians. Running Mead, as I said, has it. There's one on the Ryan Goon Memorial. There is 12 on the Gibraltar Memorial. So they're actually kind of all over the place, which is really important that we go visit these memorials and we trying to figure out what is a memorial and what is not. It's sometimes hard on the War Graves website because sometimes cemeteries are called memorial gardens. They're actually cemeteries. But there's a lot of missing that you can visit all over the world without trying hard. So if you're a Canadian, say, serving in somewhere in Europe or in the Middle East, you could actually go visit these Canadians, and they're there. Those memorials are still looked after. So how can you commemorate? An act of remembrance is, in fact, a very personal thing. Larger cemeteries and memorials will often have big ceremonies, but there are many that do not get visited at all. So everybody asks me, hey, I want to go do Vimy Ridge, Remembrance Day at Vimy Ridge. I always tell people, well, you've missed it if you want to go on Remembrance Day, because their ceremony happens on Remembrance Sunday in the British fashion, and only happens every second year because it alternates between Vimy Ridge and Beaumont Hamel. So, yes, everybody wants to go to Vimy Ridge. If you see the Passchendaele Memorial, it always gets visited. But if you go to some of the smaller ones, you'll find they hardly get visited at all, and you can actually do your own personal and private act of remembrance or ceremony there. So in 2020, my wife and I were restricted to Germany because of Corona. And so we chose the closest cemetery to us, which happened to be, at the time that we thought, Reichswald Forest Cemetery, which has 705 Canadians, 704 Air Force, and 1 Army, out of a total of 7,500 burials. We didn't lay any wreaths or flowers, but we did choose to find a Canadian, and I in particular went looking for 2 pilots from 401 Squadron, who at the time, their commanding officer was a personal friend of ours. And so I could send photos of their headstones to them. At the same time, another Canadian family was there, and they laid roses at random Canadian graves as they walked through the headstones. The Poles, for example, did the same thing. They laid red and white roses at every Polish headstone and laid a massive Polish Air Force roundel. So you can kind of do what you like as long as you are paying your respect to the fallen. In 2021, I went to the Courcelette Canadian Memorial for my Remembrance Day, and I chose that because I have a personal connection to that memorial. My great-grandfather fought in that battle in the First World War with the 24th Victoria Rifles of Canada Battalion as a major, and participated in the battle and the heavy fighting around that area. I was the only person at that memorial. There was no wreaths. There was no ceremony. There was nothing. It was just me spending my moment of silence standing on the battlefield. I visited several small cemeteries that day before I had to return home, and I was extremely moved by the fact that I was the only person that was around that day. Even the French weren't really around. Turns out they also celebrate Remembrance Sunday. But I was at Courcelette Cemetery, Sunken Road, Second Canadian, Adenac, Regina Trench. I was the only person, and I walked every single headstone. I returned in 2023 with my wife and another couple who had also a connection to the battle. His great-great-uncle had fought with the 22nd French Canadian Battalion in the exact same battle and actually had stormed the town of Courcelette. In that time, we laid a wreath at the memorial and visited the 6 cemeteries close by and generally spent the day visiting the fallen. So there's no real right or wrong way to commemorate the fallen, other than to not commemorate them. When visiting a CWGC cemetery or memorial or a grave is an actual personal act of remembrance. Walking through the cemetery, looking at the headstones, signing the guest book, and taking the time to reflect on the sacrifice made are all acts of remembrance. If you want to buy a wreath, you can buy wreaths from the Commonwealth War Graves Commission offices or at some of the larger memorials or local museums. A good example is sometimes at Posiers at the Tommy, you can get them, or you can get them at the Thiepval Memorial as well. Their hotel, the Holiday Inn Express in Arras, will also sell Poppy Legion wreaths. So you can find them, or you can buy flowers and just lay them. That also works. Some people lay wooden crosses at graves of unknown soldiers. Sometimes you'll see them at locations or places. You'll see pictures of family members. If you have a fallen family member, often people will leave a picture behind. And those will remain completely undisturbed by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission until they are basically disintegrated. They almost never clear them unless they're becoming destroyed to the point of not reading. The Commonwealth War Grave Commission website lists not only all of the fallen, but also where they are from, and most cemetery memorials are actually in Google Maps. So finding them can be much, much easier than trying to figure out where they are on a map. Most Canadian war dead have not been visited by their families, as it was far too expensive and the distance too great. I had the pleasure a couple of times of taking people to visit family members, and they were the first person, it was over 100 years later, that a family member finally got to visit them. I have two particular examples. I took a friend of my wife's who on the whim just said, "Oh, I have some family members somewhere." We looked them up, figured out where they were. One was on the Thiepval Memorial, and one was at a little tiny dressing station, field ambulance cemetery in Pas-de-Calais. And she was the first person in her family to ever visit them, and they're British. So it is really moving. A lot of these guys don't get visited. There's one Canadian at Grand Court Road Cemetery. I was on a personal pilgrimage and trip, and we went out of our way and we walked to that one lone Canadian down a terrible French farm road over an artillery shell, which I'm really good at driving and parking on, to go visit this one Canadian from the 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles. Other things you can do as acts of remembrance. You can go to the ceremonies. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission website, if you're in Europe, lists when they're doing burials or rededication ceremonies. There was one just on the 31st of October of a Canadian who was finally identified in a cemetery, and they rededicated his headstone, and members of his regiment or the unit that carries it on today perpetuates it there along with family members. If you look at this bottom right, our bottom left-hand corner photo, it's of one of those ceremonies. That is me taking the photo. That is a member of the 5th Canadian Mounted Rifles that was identified in 2021, and a master warrant officer named Mike Hogan and I went to that cemetery together to see the ceremony and be part of that. We were like the only 2 Canadian civilians. What was shocking was how many French civilians showed up from the town to commemorate. He was laid by members of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment because they were laying one of their known, and so they had first pick to go 2 days later at New Irish Farm. So it was a very moving weekend. So another interesting one, there's a photo at the bottom. It's a young lady touching a headstone. So that was the second person. It was my very first battlefield tour. That family member, we actually conveniently, it's right behind Vimy Ridge. He fell at Hill 70 and he was wounded and hauled off the battlefield and put at La Targette. That was the first family member to visit ever. And she went to go visit. I asked anybody if they had anybody. We had one on Vimy Ridge, and we had her, and we visited them both. Finding the person on Vimy Ridge, I had figured would take 3 hours. It took us 5 minutes, which is shocking because there's no reference card or guide at Vimy Ridge. It's alphabetical by rank in circles around the memorial. This guy was in La Targette. He was fairly easy to find. You'll see I'm in a photo on the very, very right-hand side. That's me visiting a Canadian REME member. So I had the honor of visiting REME graves and taking photos. That was the regiment that I served with for 30 years. And so these are little acts of remembrance. I visited more headstones than you can shake a stick at, and I love every single one. I go to them all. I touch almost every one I can. These are little acts of remembrance that make it much more personal, and you can do these things yourself. You can find the cemeteries close by through the website, or you can message me through my Woolsey's War Walk Facebook group, and we can help you discover what's close to you. Recently, I actually had the honor of going with my son to the Enville Presbyterian Cemetery and finding there's 4 fallen in there, 2 Second World War, 2 First World War. The RAF guy has never been visited by his family as far as we can tell. Because it just would have been too far. He died in 1918. So every time you go, or anywhere you go and you visit one of these, it's a personal act of remembrance, and that is the best way to do it. So planning a visit, I always recommend you visit the CWGC website and find a cemetery or memorials near you, and pick a list of them. Everybody goes to the big ones. Everybody goes to Vimy. Everybody goes to Meningate. Everybody goes to Tynecott. Everybody goes to Betty-sur-Mer. But there are a lot of others that people don't ever go to. Bolton, Adigam, Sunken Road, Courcelette. There are just thousands of thousands. Hangard Wood. There's lots of them that just don't get any attention. Look at the cemetery details and the casualties, so you know what you're looking for and who you're looking for. If you're just going for interest sake, absolutely find the cemetery, walk the grounds, see them, and then look them up. I've done that many times. But oftentimes when I go, I'll have a full list of who's in that cemetery and some details about them. The War Graves Commission will have it. You can download it to an Excel form, or in my case, I get to look them up because that's what I do. And I get sometimes to visit very, very specific people, and sometimes you just are visiting. I also then go to Google Maps, and you can also search for memorials and or monuments and see if there's anything close to you. You'd be amazed how many Canadian memorials there are. So the one on the bottom left photo is the Basley Memorial. That is taken on the 6th of June. I was about to guide the Royal Canadian Logistics Service. I was doing a recce for a site. I needed a site for Le Régiment de la Chaudière. Turns out they were in this, it's a town that's joined Basley and another town. That's at their Remembrance Day ceremony. The mayor basically glommed onto us because we were Canadians. This is a memorial put up by the French, in fact. And just across, that's the mayor's office, and the church is right there where the 51st Highland guy is. And across the square from where this Canadian memorial is a school that's named for a Canadian, because that was the field ambulance location of 23rd Canadian Field Ambulance in the Battle of Normandy for 57 days. That's Ecole Bud Hammond, which is an incredibly moving story. So you can find these places and find the memorials and go to these places and participate. In France on the 6th of June, or that weekend, the French will have a remembrance ceremony to commemorate the fallen that liberated, and then they have a celebration celebrating their liberation. It's an incredible experience. It's a madhouse in Normandy on the anniversary, and you can't get to many of the good sites, like the big popular sites, but you get to the smaller ones where the smaller memorials are, and the French absolutely love it. The other one beside it is one that I tripped over. I was driving to go see my family in Ottawa on Thanksgiving, and my daughter was coming from Montreal, and we stopped at Pizza in Bancroft as we were driving from Wasaga Beach to Bancroft. That's the Bancroft Memorial. That's got all the names of all the men that fell in the First and Second World War, and in Korea, in fact, in the town of Bancroft and the surrounding areas. So they are literally everywhere. And you can look these guys up, and sometimes if you look at the memorial in your hometown and know who's there, you can possibly find their graves because you look it up on the Commonwealth War Graves Commission website, and you can go visit them. And then you just go visit. So if you're living in Belgium, there are hundreds of cemeteries to go visit. If you're in France, there's hundreds. In the Netherlands, there's dozens. If you're in other parts of the world, such as Norway, most people don't realize there's 51 Canadians buried in Norway. The Canadian military people there asked me if they could do any commemorations there, and I gave them the list and locations. So you can do that. Either look it up on your own or contact me, and I can help you do that. Canada's war dead from the First and Second World War are truly all over this world. And if you have the opportunity, go visit a CWGC website and cemetery, site, or memorial, and take the time. Thank you very much.
All right. I'll let a few seconds pass by, but in the meantime, I'd just like to thank all of you for joining us. And if somebody's watching this on the later date, thank you as well. But I most of all want to thank Rob. Thank you for your time, and thank you for this important event. I'm happy we could have it before Remembrance Day. That way everybody can remember in their own way. So thank you for that.
My pleasure, everyone. And remember, they're actually literally everywhere, so it takes no effort to go visit.
Well, have a great night, everyone, or a great day, depending where you are in the world. And tune in next time for another battlefield tour. We will be taking a break around December, but we will be back in January. So keep an eye out.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye. Or ciao.